On a snowy February night in 1978, 5 young men vanished without a trace in the remote wilderness of Northern California. And what followed still defies logic over 4 decades later. Their car was found abandoned on a desolate mountain road, the engine working gas in the tank doors unlocked and snacks left uneaten. Yet there were no signs of the men, no footprints, no struggle, only silence and snow. When one of their bodies was discovered months later in a Forest Service trailer, starved to death beside untouched food and heat, it only deepened the mystery. Why did they leave a perfectly functioning vehicle? Why ignore life-saving supplies? And what happened to the one man never found? Known now as the Yuba County Five, their story has become one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. A haunting tale of friendship, fear, and a journey into the unknown, where every answer leads to more questions. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable. It began like any other Friday night. On February 24th, 1978, 5 close friends from Yuba City, California, piled into a car and headed north to Chico State University to watch a college basketball game. They were excited, not just for the game, but because the next day they were set to compete in a Special Olympics tournament, something they had been training and dreaming about for weeks. These 5 young men, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Ted Weiher, were bound not only by friendship but also by their shared experiences with mental or developmental disabilities. They were beloved sons and brothers, living relatively simple but full lives, with routines that brought them joy and comfort. Their families trusted them, respected their independence, and had every reason to believe they would be back home that night, asleep in their beds, resting up for the big day ahead. They never made it home. The last confirmed sighting of the Yuba County Five was at a convenience store in Chico around 10 p.m. A clerk remembered them clearly. Nothing seemed unusual. They were laughing, chatting, and buying snacks, chocolate milk soda candy bars, and Hostess pies. Just 5 guys enjoying an ordinary night. But what happened after they left that store remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in American true crime history. By the next morning, when the men failed to return, panic set in almost immediately. These weren't reckless teenagers staying out too late. These were men who adhered to structure, who would never miss their tournament without a very good reason. Their families knew something was wrong. The police were contacted, and soon the search began. Days later, a breakthrough came, though it only deepened the mystery. A forest ranger discovered Jack Madruga's prized 1969 Mercury Montego, abandoned on a remote dirt road in the snow-covered wilderness of Plumas National Forest, about 70 miles from Chico. It was a rugged area, miles off any logical route between Chico and Yuba City. The car had no damage, no flat tires, and wasn't stuck in the snow. In fact, it started easily when tested. The keys were missing, but the doors were unlocked and a window was rolled down. Inside, the snack wrappers from the convenience store were still there, half-eaten, undisturbed. But the men were gone. and there were no tracks or footprints leading away from the car. The snow had since covered any trail they might have left, erasing their passage, as if they had vanished into thin air. Why would they have driven so far into the mountains? None of them were known to enjoy the outdoors, especially not Jack Madruga, who hated the cold and was meticulous about his car. He never would have driven it off paved roads without a compelling reason. Investigators were baffled. Helicopters flew overhead, dogs were brought in to search the forest, volunteers trudged through freezing snowdrifts, calling the boys names. But nothing turned up. No clothing, no bodies, no supplies. Just a car alone and inexplicably far from where it should have been parked, at the edge of one of California's most remote and inhospitable landscapes. The media dubbed them the Yuba County Five, and soon the case became national news. But with each passing day, the trail grew colder. Their families, once clinging to hope, began to prepare for the worst. For weeks, then months, nothing surfaced. No credible leads, no tips, only rumors and speculation. The men had simply disappeared, leaving behind a perfectly operable vehicle and a wilderness full of unanswered questions. To understand the chilling depth of the mystery, it's important to revisit that car, the Mercury Montego. It held more than snack wrappers and eerie silence. It represented a contradiction at the heart of the case. Found at an elevation of over 4,000 feet, the vehicle had made it up a steep, narrow, and snow-covered road typically used by logging trucks and Forest Service vehicles. The terrain was treacherous, especially at night in the dead of winter. But there, it was unscathed, as if carefully placed. There was no evidence of foul play, no dents or scrapes, no sign of distress, and yet the men were gone. The area around the car was searched extensively. Snowfall had likely erased any traceable paths, but investigators believed they spotted faint footprints that may have belonged to the group. These led away from the road and into the dense forest, eventually vanishing under the snow. Why would 5 men, some with intellectual disabilities and unfamiliar with the area, abandon the warmth and safety of a functioning car to venture into freezing wilderness at night? The men's backgrounds made the decision even more incomprehensible. Jack Madruga was protective of his car and rarely let others drive it. He wouldn't have risked it on such a remote road. Ted Weiher was afraid of the cold. Jack Hewitt had the mental capacity of a child and never would have wandered off on his own. Gary Matias, though diagnosed with schizophrenia, had been stable for years with medication and was reportedly in high spirits about the tournament. None of them had any experience with camping or survival, and all of them had been excited about playing basketball the next morning, a highlight they'd been anticipating for weeks. Rumors quickly filled the vacuum of information. Some suggested they got lost, took a wrong turn, and tried to find help. Others speculated about foul play, that perhaps someone had forced them off the road. A witness later came forward claiming he saw people who resembled the boys near the car that night, but his account was vague and inconsistent. Then there was the anonymous call received by police. Someone offered a cryptic tip about where the boys could be found, but it led nowhere. And yet the most confounding detail remained: the car could have been driven back down the mountain. There was no reason to leave it. If they were lost, Why not stay put and wait for help? Why press deeper into the unknown? And why, even as trained dogs, helicopters and dozens of volunteers combed the forest, was there no trace of them? Pluma's National Forest is vast, cold, and unforgiving in winter. Temperatures that night had dropped well below freezing, and survival without shelter or proper gear would have been nearly impossible. Still, there was no indication of a struggle, no evidence of foul play in the car itself. The scene was calm, too calm, as though the men had calmly walked away from the only thing standing between them and death. The families were tormented. They organized their own search parties, put up flyers, and offered rewards. But nothing explained why the 5 men would be where they were, or what had prompted them to leave the safety of the car and head into the forest. Theories began to pile up. Had they seen something? Had someone frightened them? Were they chasing something or fleeing it? As the snow deepened and the season changed, hope began to fade. Spring would eventually bring answers, but not peace. Because when the truth began to surface, it only made the story more disturbing, more confusing, and more tragic than anyone could have imagined. Before they became the subjects of one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries, the Yuba County Five were just 5 ordinary young men living quiet, hopeful lives in a small California town. They weren't famous, troubled, or reckless. They were sons, brothers, and friends, bound together not only by a deep sense of loyalty, but also by shared challenges. Each of the 5 had either a mild intellectual disability or a diagnosed mental health condition, which made their friendship all the more powerful. In each other, they found belonging, joy, and safety in a world that didn't always understand or include them. Gary Matthias, 25, was perhaps the most complex of the group. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia during his short-lived service in the US Army and had struggled with hallucinations and delusions for years. But in the time leading up to the disappearance, Gary had been doing well. Under medical supervision and steady medication, his symptoms were more under control. He was living with his parents, playing basketball, spending time with his friends, and trying to build a future. He had dreams of holding down a steady job, living independently, and contributing to society. His family described him as gentle and caring someone who loved to laugh and was fiercely protective of his friends. Jack Madruga, 30, was known for his quiet, responsible nature. Though he hadn't been officially diagnosed with any mental disability, he had a low IQ and often needed structure to navigate life's challenges. Still, he was fiercely independent. He'd served in the US Army and worked hard to purchase his most prized possession, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, the very car that would later be found abandoned. Jack wasn't adventurous. He preferred routine and predictability, and was particularly cautious about his vehicle. He rarely let anyone else drive it, and avoided anything that might put it at risk. To his family and friends, Jack was dependable, kind, and always looking out for the others. Then there was Bill Sterling, 29, the heart of the group. Bill had a developmental disability and lived at home with his parents. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. He loved visiting the library, reading Bible stories, and volunteering in his community. Bill's kindness was genuine and widely recognized. He had a warm way of making people feel comfortable. His family described him as trusting and loyal, someone who took great joy in small things. He loved sports and especially loved sharing his interests with his close-knit circle of friends. At 24, Jack Hewitt was the youngest of the group and perhaps the most innocent. With a learning disability that left him functioning at the level of a young child, Jack relied heavily on his parents and the protective companionship of his friends. His personality was sunny and enthusiastic. He laughed easily, loved nature, and found joy in spending time with the people he trusted most. He had a childlike excitement for life and was never happier than when he was with the others, watching sports or riding around town. And then there was Ted Weiher, 32. Ted had a mild intellectual disability, but a larger-than-life personality. He was friendly, helpful, and very active in the community, particularly with the Special Olympics, where he often volunteered. He adored sports, especially basketball, and knew stats and player details with encyclopedic precision. Ted loved to talk about games, cheer for his favorite teams, and plan outings with his friends. His family remembered him as someone who wanted to be seen to belong and to live a life full of connection. Together, these 5 young men formed a bond that was pure and powerful. Their friendship was rooted in trust, laughter, and mutual care. Weekends often meant piling into Jack's Montego, picking up snacks, and heading to basketball games or movie theaters. They had their routines predictable, comforting, joyful, and they supported each other in ways few outside their circle truly understood. In a world that might have labeled them as different, they were simply themselves with one another, free, accepted, and happy. Their families were proud of them, not just for the progress they had made in their personal development, but for the kindness in their hearts. They were responsible. They followed the rules. And most of all, they stuck together. February 24th, 1978 should have been another joyful, uneventful Friday night. The 5 friends were excited more than usual. It was the eve of their own big basketball tournament, a Special Olympics event they had trained for and dreamed about for weeks. Ted Weiher had carefully laid out his uniform the night before, folding it with care and pride. Bill Sterling had told his family he hoped to win a medal. Their bags were packed. Their plans were clear. This was supposed to be a night of inspiration and camaraderie, watching a college game at Chico State to get motivated for their own competition the next day. They left in high spirits in Jack Madruga's Montego, a car Jack kept in pristine condition. The drive to Chico was just under an hour, and they made it with no issues. They watched the game UC Davis versus Chico State, and afterward, at around 10 p.m., they stopped at Bears Market, a local convenience store. The store clerk remembered them well. They were cheerful, polite, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They bought a few snacks, chocolate milk candy bars, Hostess Pies soda, the kind of things young men would grab after a night out. Then they got back into the car and drove off into the night. But they never came home. When the 5 didn't show up the next morning for their tournament and failed to call or return home, their families immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't just concerning, it was terrifying. These young men thrived on routine. They didn't stray from plans. They weren't impulsive. They lived carefully, deliberately, and their absence without a word was wildly out of character. Panic set in quickly. Phone calls were made, friends contacted, authorities alerted. It wasn't like them to go missing. It wasn't like them to skip something they'd been so excited about. By the time the police were informed, the families had already begun their own searches. Their sons had disappeared in the dead of night, and no one could make sense of it. That sense of confusion only deepened when the car was discovered days later in the snow-covered wilderness of Plumas National Forest, miles from any logical route between Chico and Yuba City. No one could understand it. The road they had taken wasn't on the way home. In fact, it led directly into remote mountainous terrain, an area none of them were familiar with and that some were actively afraid of. What had caused 5 cautious young men so focused on responsibility and so excited for the next day to vanish without a trace after a night that seemed perfectly normal? The clues left behind the abandoned car, the uneaten snacks, the missing keys, only raised more questions. Something had disrupted their routine in a way no one could explain. Something had pulled them off course and into a darkness that to this day remains unexplained. When Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego was discovered days after the disappearance, the details were so strange. They felt more like the setup of a psychological thriller than a missing persons case. The vehicle was found on a rutted, snow-packed dirt road deep in Plumas National Forest, over 70 miles from where the boys had last been seen. The area was remote, the kind of place you had to mean to go, to no accidental detours here. And that was the first red flag. This wasn't a road someone would take by mistake, especially not at night in late February, when temperatures regularly plunged below freezing and the snowpack swallowed everything in silence. The car was in remarkably good condition. It hadn't crashed, hadn't been vandalized, and wasn't stuck in the snow. In fact, when investigators tried starting it, the engine turned over instantly. It had about a quarter tank of gas left. The doors were unlocked. One window was rolled down and the keys were missing. Inside, there were wrappers from the snacks the men had purchased at Bear's Market, chocolate milk cartons, candy bar wrappers, half-eaten pies. It looked as though they had sat there for a while, eating their food with no indication of urgency or distress. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage. Nothing had been stolen. It was as if the car had simply been driven to that remote spot, parked, and then abandoned. And then came the strangest detail of all. There were no discernible footprints leading away from the vehicle. Though searchers initially spotted what might have been faint tracks in the snow, these soon disappeared beneath fresh snowfall. The forest around them was deathly quiet, covered in a thick white blanket, and completely devoid of any indication as to where the men had gone. No supplies were taken from the car. No distress signals had been sent. It was as though the group had stepped out of the vehicle and vanished into thin air. For investigators and family members alike, the discovery was maddening. Every detail contradicted what they knew of the 5 men. Jack Madruga, who had driven that night, was notoriously careful about his car. He wouldn't have willingly taken it up such a treacherous, unfamiliar road. The forest was unforgiving, especially in winter, and none of the five had experience in outdoor survival. They didn't go hiking. They didn't camp. They stuck to routines and predictable places. Driving into the mountains made no sense. Theories were floated, each one more bizarre than the last. Some wondered if they had been chasing something or fleeing from someone. Others speculated that perhaps they'd gotten lost, taken a wrong turn, and panicked. But if that were true, why had they not simply turned around? The road wasn't blocked, and the car was fully capable of returning the way it came. Others questioned if someone else had been involved, someone who led them into the wilderness under false pretenses or with malicious intent. But again, no sign of a struggle, no witnesses, no solid evidence. Helicopters scoured the area. Search dogs were brought in. Dozens of volunteers combed the forest and mountains, calling the men's names through the cold, dense trees. The families were tireless in their search. Flyers were distributed, local news covered every angle, and yet the woods remained silent. The more investigators learned, the less it made sense. Why drive up that road at all? Why abandon a perfectly good car in the middle of nowhere? Why walk into freezing darkness with no coats, no flashlights, no direction, and leave no trace? The sheer lack of logic made the case feel otherworldly, like some cruel joke played by the wilderness itself. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the forest kept its secrets. Then, in the heat of June, it began to give them up. On June 4th, 1978, over 4 months after the Yuba County Five vanished, tragedy finally broke through the silence. A group of motorcyclists exploring the area for fun stumbled upon an old U.S. Forest Service trailer deep in the woods, roughly 20 miles from where the Montego had been found. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest and snow-melt-swollen creeks. The building was intact, but weathered, a lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere. Inside, on a single bed, lay the body of Ted Weiher. What made the discovery unbearable wasn't just that Ted had died, it was how he had died. His body was found, wrapped tightly in 8 sheets, almost mummy-like, with several tucked around his head and shoulders, as if someone had tried to keep him warm or comfort him. His shoes were missing, and his feet were badly frostbitten. His beard had grown long, indicating that he had been alive for several weeks, possibly as long as 8 to 13 weeks after the night they disappeared. He had lost nearly half his body weight, down to around 120 pounds, and likely died from a combination of starvation and exposure. But perhaps the most haunting detail, the trailer had everything Ted needed to survive. There were canned foods, enough to last months. A propane tank that could have provided heat. Matches, books, clothing, and heavy blankets. Yet, none of it had been used. The cans remained unopened. The propane tank was full. The matches were untouched. Someone had broken a window to gain entry into the trailer, probably the group themselves. Yet, once inside, for reasons that defied comprehension, they didn't use the resources that could have saved their lives. Why had Ted starved to death, wrapped in blankets, when sustenance and warmth were quite literally within arm's reach? Had he been too confused or scared to use them? Was he alone by then? Had he been waiting for help that never came? Adding to the confusion were Gary Mathias's tennis shoes found inside the trailer, next to the bed. Ted's feet were too badly frostbitten to wear shoes, suggesting that Gary had been there alive, at least for a time. Had Gary helped wrap Ted in blankets? Had he left the trailer to get help, never to return? Or was something more unsettling at play? The discovery of Ted Weiher's body only raised more questions than it answered. The distance from the car to the trailer was staggering, nearly 20 miles through rugged terrain, deep snow and freezing temperatures. It would have been a brutal journey, even for a trained hiker, let alone a group of young men with no survival experience, dressed only in light jackets and street clothes. The fact that any of them had made it that far was astounding. The fact that they died anyway, surrounded by everything they needed to survive, was deeply disturbing. For the families and investigators, the discovery of Ted's body wasn't closure. It was a chilling reminder that something had gone very, very wrong that night in February. The mountain had claimed one of the five. But where were the others? Why had they split up? Why had they left the car at all? And most ominously, what had happened to Gary Matthias? The forest still held its secrets, but more would surface soon. And with them, the horror would only grow. In the days following the grim discovery of Ted Weiher's body in the remote Forest Service trailer, search efforts intensified. The snow had melted, revealing more of the terrain, and it was only a matter of time before the forest gave up the rest of its truth. What came next confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved and added disturbing new pieces to an already twisted puzzle. Roughly 2 miles from the trailer, searchers found the remains of Jack Hewitt. His bones were scattered in a small clearing, likely moved and picked over by wildlife. Only his spine part of his skull and a few identifiable possessions were recovered. A forensic comparison of dental records confirmed it was Jack. He had been the youngest in the group, just 24 years old, and possessed the emotional and cognitive development of a child. His family had always feared he would be the most vulnerable in a crisis. That fear was now a brutal reality. Soon after, about a quarter mile from where Jack Hewitt was found, they discovered clothing and skeletal remains belonging to Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga. Jack's remains were found partially consumed by animals, his body lying near the edge of the road, as if he had collapsed or laid down in exhaustion. Bill's bones were scattered nearby, along with bits of clothing and shoes. Neither of them had made it to the trailer. Neither had found shelter. The location of the bodies painted a horrifying picture. It appeared that after leaving the car, the group had attempted to navigate the harsh terrain in freezing temperatures without proper clothing or gear. They had no maps, no flashlights, no survival supplies. The only hope for warmth or safety lay in the direction of the trailer, but only Ted had made it that far, and he had perished despite having everything he needed to live. Why had the group split up? Were they lost and disoriented? Did some of them grow too weak or frostbitten to continue? Did they argue or panic? The paths their bodies traced across the wilderness seemed to follow no pattern, no logic. It was as if the cold and fear had scattered them like leaves in the wind. Even more chilling, Jack Madruga's body was found with his car keys in his pocket. He could have driven the Montego back down the mountain, yet, for reasons unknown, they had chosen to abandon the vehicle and trek into the deadly wilderness. Bill Sterling, too, had been dressed only in street clothes. There were no signs that any of the men had been prepared for the conditions they faced. With 4 of the 5 men now confirmed dead, each in conditions more tragic and bewildering than the last one, question still loomed above all others. Where was Gary Matthias? Gary Matthias was the last remaining member of the group still unaccounted for, and perhaps the most complicated. His tennis shoes were found inside the trailer beside Ted Weiher's body, suggesting he had been there. Investigators believe Ted might have been wearing Gary's shoes at the time of his death, possibly because his own feet had become too frostbitten to bear anything else. This alone was telling. Gary had clearly survived the initial trek from the car, and at the very least had made it to the trailer alive. But from there, his trail vanished completely. Unlike the others, no trace of Gary's remains was ever found. No clothing, no bones, no personal effects. Nothing. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. This total absence only added fuel to the speculation surrounding his fate. Had he ventured out again from the trailer in search of help and died somewhere even deeper in the wilderness, in a location so remote that no one had yet found him? That theory seemed plausible, even likely. After all, someone had broken into the trailer, wrapped Ted in blankets, and possibly tried to care for him. Gary may have done all of that, then left never to return. But as the years passed, and no sign of him emerged, darker theories began to take root. Some suggested that Gary, who had a well-documented history of schizophrenia, had suffered a psychotic break that night. They theorized that perhaps he had convinced the others to follow him into the forest, claiming they were in danger or believing they were headed somewhere safe. Under that theory, he may have led them deeper and deeper until it was too late to turn back. This possibility, while unnerving, was never substantiated. Those who knew Gary, including his doctors, insisted he had been stable for years, diligently taking his medication and exhibiting no signs of paranoia or delusion in the months leading up to the trip. He was optimistic about the future and excited about the basketball tournament. The idea that he suddenly snapped didn't sit right with his family or with many investigators. Others wondered if Gary had survived even longer than Ted. Could he have been the one to wrap Ted so carefully in those blankets, then ventured out to find help, dying silently somewhere miles away? Although few wanted to say it aloud, was it possible that Gary hadn't died at all? Had he somehow made it out of the woods and chosen never to return? If so, where was he, and why hadn't he contacted anyone? His family refused to believe he would abandon them, not after all they had done to support him through his illness. Still, his absence fed the rumors. A few even whispered that maybe Gary had played a darker role, that he had caused harm to the others. But once again, there was no evidence to support that idea, and the people who knew him best rejected it outright. The mystery of Gary Matthias's fate remains the most haunting element of the Yuba County Five case. With no body, no confirmed sightings, and no final resting place, he is the ghost at the center of the story, the missing piece in a puzzle that refuses to be solved. Every time a new theory arises, it runs into the same wall. The facts, as strange and fragmented as they are, simply don't add up. Why did Gary's shoes end up in the trailer, but not Gary himself? Why was Ted surrounded by survival resources, but still died of exposure and starvation? Why did the group leave the safety of their vehicle at all? Every answer only leads to more questions. And in the heart of it all is the boy, who vanished completely, whose story may hold the key to everything, and who for over 4 decades has remained both a suspect and a victim in equal measure. As the facts surrounding the Yuba County Five grew clearer, the mystery only deepened. With 4 of the 5 men confirmed dead and 1 still missing, the world began to ask why. Why did these 5 young men, none of whom were prone to risk-taking or unfamiliar places, end up in a remote forest in the dead of winter, so far from the route home? Why did they leave a perfectly functioning car that could have taken them to safety? And perhaps most chilling of all, why did Ted Weiher, after making it to a trailer stocked with food and heating supplies, still die of starvation and cold? These questions have spawned countless theories, each one compelling, each one flawed. The most basic explanation is that they got lost. Perhaps they took a wrong turn after the basketball game and became disoriented. In this version, fear and confusion led them up the mountain road where snow and darkness trapped them. They abandoned the car, hoping to find help, and became separated in the vast wilderness. But this theory falls apart under scrutiny. Jack Madruga, the driver, was familiar with the roads between Chico and Yuba City. The detour that led them to the forest was not a simple wrong turn. It required navigating several offshoots, driving for miles into higher elevations, and ignoring more obvious paths home. It was not a mistake, easily made, especially not by someone like Jack, who hated the cold and avoided backroads. Another theory suggests they were chased or lured by someone or something. Some believe the men witnessed something they weren't supposed to see or encountered, a person who led them into the forest under false pretenses. Rumors have long circulated about criminal activity in the region, drug operations, cult activity, or even illegal logging, and perhaps the group stumbled upon something dangerous. But again, there's no evidence to support this. The car showed no signs of struggle. The bodies showed no wounds. If foul play occurred, it left behind no physical trace. A related idea is that the group fled in fear, possibly thinking they were being followed or hunted. This could explain the panicked decision to leave the car and walk miles through treacherous terrain without preparation. But what exactly were they running from? There were no reported threats, no signs of a chase, and no logical reason for the fear to have taken hold, unless it came from within. That brings us to Gary Matias. His history of schizophrenia has long cast a shadow over the case. Could he have experienced a psychotic episode convincing the others they were in danger? Could he have led them up the mountain in a state of delusion? It's possible. But by all accounts, Gary had been stable for years. He was taking his medication. He was excited for the basketball tournament and had shown no signs of distress or confusion. And even if he had suffered a sudden break, would the others have followed him so blindly into the woods, abandoning their only safe haven? The most unsettling details remain the ones with no explanation. Why didn't Ted Weiher use the propane heater or eat the canned food? Why did Gary's shoes end up in the trailer if his body was never found? Why did the group split up when their best chance of survival would have been to stay together? Every theory that seeks to explain the mystery eventually hits the same wall. None of it makes sense. It defies logic, defies psychology, even defies common survival instincts. Over time, speculation has grown more outlandish. Some speak of supernatural causes. Others suggest secret government activity or missing time. But even the more grounded theories, mental illness, criminal involvement, or tragic error, can't reconcile the full list of baffling details. The case in its rawest form is a portrait of chaos wrapped in silence. A perfectly working car, untouched supplies, and 5 young men who walked into the snow and never came back. More than 4 decades have passed since the Yuba County Five vanished into the cold, dark wilderness of Plumas National Forest. The snow has long melted. The trees have grown taller. The trailer still stands quiet and faded with time. And yet, the case remains a raw, aching mystery, an unanswered question that continues to haunt those who remember it. For the family's time has done little to ease the pain. The parents, siblings, and loved ones of the 5 men spent years searching for closure, posting flyers, talking to reporters, walking through the woods, on anniversaries, laying flowers by that lonely trailer door. Some passed away without ever knowing the truth. Others carry the weight of uncertainty every day. The pain of not knowing what happened, why it happened, or what their sons went through is the kind that never heals. Gary Matthias's disappearance still casts a long shadow. His sister for years held out hope he might still be alive, living off the grid, or too scared to return. Online communities have taken up the cause, trading theories, sharing maps, analyzing photos and documents. But no new evidence has surfaced. No new clue has emerged. The trail remains as cold as the February night it all began. The story of the Yuba County Five has since become a staple of American true crime lore. Books, podcasts, and documentaries revisit the mystery regularly. Each generation of sleuths returns to the facts, hoping to find something everyone else missed. But the same details remain: a car abandoned, without cause, food left untouched, in a place meant for survival, a group of men who never should have gone into those woods, and a silence that refuses to break. And yet, for all the darkness and confusion, the legacy of the Yuba County Five is not solely one of tragedy. It is also a story of friendship, of 5 young men who found joy, purpose, and connection in each other. They cheered for one another, protected one another, and spent their final days together, not as victims, but as brothers in spirit. They were kind, loyal, and loved by their families, their friends, and eventually by a world that came to know their names, not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Their story reminds us that life is fragile, that mystery can linger in even the most ordinary moments, and that some questions may never be answered. But as long as people continue to ask those questions, as long as their names are spoken and their stories remembered, the Yuba County Five are not truly lost. They live on in every theory, every retelling, and every heart still searching for the truth. And perhaps, one day, somewhere in the silence of the pines, or the forgotten corners of a case file, an answer will come. Until then, we remember, we wonder, and we wait. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support truly means the world to me. If this video brought you value or resonated with you in any way, feel free to leave a like a little comment or hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments together. See you in the next one.